Welcome to the final panel of the Free Enterprise and Democracy Network Conference on making the case for democracy and markets. I've been looking forward to this one. I am Kim Bettcher, Director of Policy and Program Learning at CIPE and also manager of the Free Enterprise and Democracy Network Secretariat. So I do hope that you've been enjoying the conference and got to meet a few of the FEDN members. Making the case for democracy and markets is something that FEDN and CIPE have been doing all along, and yet it feels particularly urgent and topical at this time. I suppose that in this audience, you already are in favor of democracy and market economies, or hopefully at least one of the two. And yet we cannot take this for granted in the world, or really any part of the world. There was a poll taken by the International Republican Institute of 42 countries recently that asked the question, posed the statement, there is no substitute for the democratic system. It is the best possible system. Well, 2/3 of respondents agreed with that. And indeed, we expect majorities to be in favor of democracy under any regime. However, the younger the respondents, the fewer would agree that democracy is irreplaceable. And in the United States in 2011, 24% of young Americans stated that democracy is a bad or a very bad way of running the country. And support in the United States for army rule has increased over the years from 1 in 16 in 1995 to 1 in 6 in that same survey. Turning to the economy, you have probably seen many studies and know that in many parts of the world, the preferred job is a government job, not a job in business, the private sector. And CIPE did surveys in 3 countries just over a year ago, looking at the role of business and the role of government in the economy. Now, in Ukraine, for example, trust in business was significantly higher than it was in other institutions in society. In response to the statement, the government's role in the economy should be strengthened and private companies should be more regulated. In Ukraine, 59% agreed with that statement. But take a country like Tunisia, where 90% agreed with that statement. And Tunisia is a country where the market reforms and economic development just did not happen ever since the Arab Spring. So desperate need for greater access to opportunity in markets, and yet 90% would still agree with that statement. In short, despite the enormous benefits democracy and market economies have yielded on the whole, they have lost their luster and face competing narratives. It's clear we need to do a better job of making the case. In this session, we'll be talking about what are the arguments and how do we present them. Now, I'm going to introduce the panel. To begin, Dr. Sami Atallah, founding director of the Policy Initiative. So a policy entrepreneur, formerly director of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies for about a decade, and that is how CIPE has known him as a partner. He has numerous publications, and I'll point out that he has done policy studies on political and social sectarianism, performance of parliament, electoral behavior, and role of municipalities in dealing with the Syrian refugee crisis and oil and gas governance. He served on the committee established by the Lebanese Prime Minister to draft a decentralization law. He has degrees from Yale University, Columbia University, and New York University. Dr. Graeme Ramshaw is with us from the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, and he has served multiple roles there as Director of Research and Evaluation and Quality and Innovation. He oversees a portfolio of partnerships linked to democracy and governance research. Lots of development experience with UK Department for International Development, World Bank, International IDEA, Brookings, and the National Democratic Institute. About a year ago, I had the opportunity to collaborate with Graeme on a report called Global Britain for an Open World, and I recommend to you his article in the Journal of Democracy on Democracy's Development Dividend. And Bernstein, who is the head of the Center for Development and Enterprise in South Africa, has really been a leading voice for development and democracy in South Africa, and recognized by the Financial Times as having the leading policy institute in the country. She was a member of the transition team and the Board of Development Bank of Southern Africa. She's been a Reagan-Fusels Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. And I point out to you particular works. She also is prolific. She has a book on the case for business in developing economies, a book with Peter Berger on business and democracy, cohabitation or contradiction. And I had, again, the pleasure to work with Anne on a project called Democracy Works, looking at the experience of South Africa, Brazil, and India. And we are fortunate to have from Poland, Marek Tatala, who is Vice President and CEO of the Economic Freedom Foundation, which invests in a variety of initiatives, including on rule of law. Formerly, he was Vice President of the Civil Development Forum, founded by Leszek Balcerowicz, which means that Marek knows a thing or two about Poland's transition from communism to a market economy. He works in the fields of public policy, communication, regulation, law, and economics. He is well known to Atlas Network, the Global Influencer Summit, and others with degrees from the University of Bristol and the Warsaw School of Economics. Welcome to our panel. I really can't think of a more capable and balanced panel to talk about these questions. Note to the audience that this session is being recorded, and you can enter questions in the chat at any time. All right, let's get started. I'd like to start with you, Sami, from Lebanon. What kind of arguments do you make in favor of democracy? You know, what is the need? Why is it a priority?
Thanks, Kim, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me start first with the whole concept of democracy, right? What do we really mean by democracy? Because we started talking about the threats against democracy, and obviously we see that is evident in the last few years, maybe the last decade. But is democracy only about just elections we're talking about, or we're talking about liberties, you know, of rights and associations? Are we talking about the rule of law, or are actually we're talking about all? You know, and some people would even go as far as say it's also about the free media, it's all about the independence of the judiciary, right? And while we aspire to have all of these, and most often a lot of these concepts that I've mentioned, they are highly correlated, right? They usually go together. But I think it's important to sort of figure out what we mean by that. And I think people have different definitions of what we mean by democracy. Because the more elements we put into that definition, the more comprehensive the whole notion of democracy, but also it becomes less useful as a concept to study. For example, then if you really want to know, does the rule of law affect elections, right? You know what I mean? Then we can no longer answer that question, you know, because now they're all entangled in one concept as a part of the definition of democracy. So that is something important, because also when we get to the crisis of democracy, what are we talking about? What are the checklists that we're looking into here? Are we talking about, again, you know, what are the elements or the pillars that make democracy? So that I could say, okay, what's my definition of democracy? I want to reduce it to elections, whereby, you know, people are actually electing or selecting their governments and removing the incumbents, because, you know, that's part of that. So part of it's about representation for me, but also there's a second part, which is a very important pillar. It's about accountability in the system. So, and if you when you ask me, hey, what's the argument for it? I mean, besides all the important features that come with democracy, whether they're part of the definition or associated with that democracy, to me, it's a major mechanism to process conflict in any society. Because in any society we're in, there are different groups that get organized, and there's a need of a way to actually resolve these different preferences, different interests, And the best way to do that still remains a democratic process that can do so in an orderly fashion, whereby different organizations or political groups organize themselves, structure the way in a way they can compete, they can absorb the shocks, they can regulate it. And as long as they're engaging in these activities within some sort of a democratic institutional framework, that's pretty good for me, because then they're operating within a system that's actually should be inclusive. And as long as they feel they can actually play within a system, and then, hey, if they lose the election today, they can win it. There's a possibility they can win it tomorrow. That gives the prospect for a, if I may call it, a democratic game to remain intact, where all the actors actually become loyalists to a democratic process. So to me, yes, we definitely need to uphold democratic institutions to resolve these conflicts, because I don't see any other regime that actually can do that in an orderly manner. Other societies have resolved conflicts through violence. Of course, you can do that through repression, you know, and hence this is what makes democracy sort of a special one. Now, the last point on this issue, not to take a lot of time, if we're looking at in the last decade or so, you've already mentioned some of these surveys, right? You know, where people sort of maybe support for democracy has sort of declined in a way. As much as I think these surveys are important, I don't think they're consequential at the end of the day for democratic regimes, because at the end of the day, they are going to be, they have to be filtered through organized political groups. So essentially, you don't really need Democrats for democracy to hold. And why am I saying that? Because if you have opposing groups that are fighting, but they realize that the best way to do that is to have this institution that's democratic, then they'll be forced into that process of actually playing the game, despite the fact that they both hate it, but they know they're bound to play it. Otherwise, there'll be violence and civil wars, essentially. Now, but if I look also at the reality, we do see an erosion of traditional parties. I'm talking here particularly in the West, with the rise of the right as well. And the question is it the rise of the right or the loss of the center? Or the loss of people voting who are centrist by definition, they're losing faith in the system, or they're not interested anymore. And this becomes the issue of, okay, this is where we have problems. We have problems because we see that people lost trust, and I think it's reflected in the survey you're saying. And how are we going to deal with that? How are we going to make sure two things happen, in my opinion? One is to enlarge that institutional arrangement or framework whereby we make sure all the political actors can play within that in an orderly fashion. But that's not enough, because you can bring different parties. And I think often what we forget to talk about is how do we deepen it to actually serve the people? Because also people's loss and trust is they feel that the system, even if it's democratic, that is actually not serving their well-being, it's serving other interest groups, which makes them actually despise maybe not so much democracy, but the institutions that this democratic infrastructure is based on. I'll stop right here to give others the chance to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Sami, for unpacking this big idea. Unpacking this big idea of democracy and pointing out you may not be calling for more democracy per se in elections, but calling for accountability, calling for better institutions or a competitive game, and interesting also, you know, who should we be talking to? And there's this somehow there's this missing center that, you know, who has become the median voter. Graeme, turning to you, how do you make the case for democracy, and maybe in what kind of situations do you need to make that case?
Thanks, Kim, and thanks again for the invitation. Picking up on Sami's point, I mean, I think our arguments are based on sort of two premises. The first is that there's been too much focus on democracy as a destination rather than a continuum. So this idea that there is some point at which you have reached democracy, and then therefore we can sort of stop worrying about it, and it sort of gets codified, and then everyone sort of forgets about that it's something that actually needs to be continually maintained and continually contested. And also this sort of, which echoes Sami's point, too much focus on form over practice. You know, we zero in on the institutions, the structures, sort of what constitutes these sort of aspects of democracy, and worry less about whether they're actually working in the way in which they are intended. And so this has some negative implications and sort of sets us up for this idea that there need to be trade-offs, because essentially if you view democracy as a checklist that you need to tick off various things, then you are going to then have other checklists that you also have to tick off, and then you have to make choices between which checklist you choose to sort of invest in. And what we're trying to make the argument is actually it shouldn't be a checklist. That actually these things are, if you look at it as the way they work, then you can actually reach objectives that are mutually beneficial, and that we don't need to be falling into the trap of accepting the idea that this is a trade-off between either having a developmental focus or a democratic focus for the work that we're doing. In terms of what's sort of sticking in the UK in terms of an idea around democracy, it is sort of coming out of the sort of an open society approach, the idea that democracies have an ability to adapt, you know, and I think this is particularly relevant in the context of sort of the Ukraine situation at the moment, that, you know, this idea that democracies can learn, that democracies can sort of change tack when things aren't going the way that they anticipate. And that's something that sort of authoritarian and autocratic regimes can't do. And I think that has important implications for the market and for economic aspects, which I'm sure the other panelists will reference as well. And so this is a sort of area where we're starting to see some correlation and some interest from the UK government in terms of how democracy fits into a narrative of sort of economic growth at the same time.
That's really interesting how you raise a point that it's not always constructive to think of democracy as an ideal destination, but that's not necessarily a discouraging thing. You know, we can think about it as being actively adapting. And I'm curious, Graeme, because I know you've worked on development and you spoke about trade-offs. So Tom Carruthers has talked about this kind of skepticism in the development profession towards democracy. And do you find yourself making the case to development professionals?
Yeah, I mean, regularly. I think there's an idea here that that contestation or debate slows things down. You know, that we all know where we're headed, that there's sort of an ideal policy track, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but that there's an ideal policy track that's already been agreed, and people talking about it too much just slows down its implementation. And so therefore having democratic processes that try to sort of include people or get participation or get sort of debate going around different things is not necessarily ideal when you're trying to sort of stimulate sort of, you know, quick economic growth. But what we're saying is actually, and then what I hope we talk about later, is that, you know, this should be part of the process, that, you know, because you're looking for an outcome that's inclusive. And if you don't include people at the beginning, how do you expect that outcome will be inclusive at the end? So yeah, so I think that's where we're trying to make this case that again, that you don't need to do one and then the other, but actually doing both together could yield better outcomes for both.
All right, thank you for that. Anne, what arguments are you making for business and markets? I don't know if you've changed any arguments since you wrote your book, and how's that going in South Africa?
Well, let me say at the outset that I am a Democrat, and democracy is really important for my organization and for South Africans, I think, with the history that we've had. We spend a lot of time talking about growth because I think without much faster growth, South Africa will struggle to remain a democracy. So there is a very direct relationship here. And let me go back to Sami's point, which is one of definition. I think a lot of people have a sort of 19th century view of capitalism with the sort of history South Africa has had. And we spend a lot of time trying to explain what modern firms look like, and that South Africa needs many more of them, that we should spend a lot less time criticizing what firms might have done in the past, or how, they're not perfect today, which many have improved a lot but are not perfect, and spend a lot more time on getting more firms. So I think how you understand business really matters. And business, of course, is not like government, although many people seem to think you can dial up both of those and say, what is your view on X? Because business is a sector, and it's comprised of many different interests and sizes of firms and all sorts of things that are different. Big egos and big corporations and small firms that are competing. So what is business is important. In South Africa, that obviously with our history has a racial dimension, and how we can get more and more Black South Africans owning firms, starting firms, and being part of the modern economy is a really important issue. So for us, that's one part of the sort of discussions that we have. The other is about growth. Now, there's a global debate about trickle-down growth, and it never trickles down, or you're dead before it trickles down to you. And there are a lot of myths about this in South Africa, as well as debate. So, for example, in the 2000s, we did manage a wonderful period for a whole lot of reasons of 4 or 5% growth per annum. But everybody likes to say, oh, but this was jobless growth. The truth is, it wasn't jobless growth at all. There were about 2 million new jobs created, many of them of very different kinds. So I think the nature of growth in South Africa is part of what we discuss, whether you believe in growth through inclusion or inclusive growth is a subtle debate, but we're a country that is struggling. We have more than half, well, we have the worst unemployment rate in the world, which is pretty devastating and catastrophic. And if you're a young person aged 15 to 34, you're about 70% unemployed, which is terrible. So we have a growing problem of poverty and unemployment, even in democratic South Africa, and which sort of testing our commitment to does democracy work, but including people in the modern economy is an important part of the debate, and the role of the state. So many South Africans want a developmental state, which is understandable if you think of our history. The state is now mainly controlled by Black South Africans, and they want it to do all sorts of things. The problem is, whatever you think ideologically, we don't have a developmental state. We have a very weak and corrupt state, unfortunately. And the state is increasingly unable to do very much at all. And that, in many ways, if you believe in markets, as I do, is both a strength and a weakness. On the one hand, we need more markets and we need more people involved in those markets. On the other hand, you do need a capable state to ensure competition and various other things within the market, a facilitating state. So I'll stop there, Kim. It gives you a feel of some of the South African issues.
Again, we hear from you that labels don't always portray sort of a common understanding. I mean, the developmental state may not be developmental. And I'm also hearing that a degree of success in itself may not be sufficient to make the case. If you create millions of jobs and people don't see that those jobs have been created, there must be something else going on in the discourse or the experience. Now, Marek, turning to you, how do you make the case for free markets?
Thank you, Kim, and thank you for inviting me for this online event. As you mentioned, I know a bit about Polish transition because this is one case that we often use for defending the market economy. That is free market reforms work, and Poland is a great example of a success story based on free market reforms, but also liberal democracy based on institutions, rule of law, many changes that were implemented in 1989. And we also try to show that these successes are not based on one particular industry or sector, but there was activity of many individuals involved in this whole process. In Poland, when you analyze the history of Polish transition, a lot of people say about so-called Balcerowicz plan, named after the leader of the reformers team. But we created a website about something we are calling Polish economic miracle, and we had a slogan there that it was also 36 million of individual plans, meaning the plans of people that were able to operate within this framework of free market economy. I also think that market economy and liberal democracy are the best mix, and that's great that they were implemented in Poland together. And things that affect democratic institutions also affect market economy. One big issue in Poland is the topic of the rule of law, and what we try to show is that it's bad for liberal democracy, for democratic institutions in Poland, but it will also affect market economy, because for market economy to operate, you need independent judiciary as well as an individual living in democracy. You need efficient court system, and we are unfortunately, currently observing deterioration in this field, worsening of independence of judiciary, and a lot of challenges with the rule of law. I also try to emphasize in a discussion about the European Union, because we are the member of the European Union, that this was another important stage in Polish economic history. We benefited a lot in terms of economic growth. Polish companies can operate freely in the big European Union market, and this was good for the market economy in Poland and in Europe as well. But it also led to improvement of quality of our institutions, and now the EU is actually defending the rule of law in Poland, together with some parts of the Polish society, against some activities of the ruling party that want to capture or influence political control over the courts. What we also try to show is that free markets are also good for open society, and I think the best case is migration to Poland. In Poland, we don't have as expanded welfare state as in Scandinavia or Germany. So migrants who come here, mostly from Ukraine, not only during the current crisis, during the Russian invasion in Ukraine, but also before, they usually enter the labor market. And this is because of opening of the labor market, because of possibilities to freely find a job in Polish economy, they integrate also quickly with the Polish society. But it's also the case of migrants from many other directions. And I think the benefit of the flexible and open labor market is that these people, integrate quickly and don't create social problems for the rest of the society. And the last argument that I think it's worth to make about the market economy, that there are many case studies of successes of entrepreneurs during difficult times. One case study is pandemic. We heard a lot about state intervention during pandemic, about governments. In Poland there were press conferences in the airports where they were bringing masks or some other equipment, but we are missing a good list of all case studies of private sector adjusting very quickly to new conditions, to digital work, to changing their production lines from producing alcohol for drinks to alcohol for sanitation. And there are like thousands of success stories like this. I think the problem is that there is not enough information and PR around these great stories, and I think they should be used more to show that even in difficult times, free markets and business activity can be very helpful to resolve issues of the society.
That's right. And Airbnb would be just one big success story coming out of a recession. And I really like that example about immigration as something very tangible that you can point to. Success stories are hard in this business because countries are complex and it's often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And when I think about the really sort of strong transition successes, I think about maybe Poland or Chile or South Korea or Taiwan, but there aren't too many that are easy to point to. So I'm glad you bring those up. Now, all right, Marek, if I can continue with you with sort of a challenging question. So success stories are valuable, but how long is success good for? Like, I've seen some studies, opinion polls, maybe not from Central Europe, but a little bit to the east, where countries that experienced significant growth and development since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and yet maybe even Eastern Germany, but people sort of longing for the old days and feeling like the market system has let them down in spite of substantial growth. How long do you think that success is good for?
I observed 2 types of nostalgia in Poland, and the one is based on I think it's among the older people who miss socialist reality, and I think they miss it mostly because they were younger. This is not based on their sympathy to the economic system or political system, but there's of course a big group of younger generation that think that socialism was not so bad, or socialism can work. And actually, I think, at least in Poland, we are missing this topic at the history classes or other, parts of the curriculum. We analyzed in my previous work, Civil Development Forum, the textbooks, history textbooks, and majority of them either completely ignored the recent 30, 40 years of economic history, or they had really bad image of transition, showing that everything bad happened because of transition. And the problem is that many of negative, things in the economy that happened after 1989 in Poland were actually not the cause was not the transition itself. Transition revealed the problems of the previous system. So, for example, the unemployment. We had the growth of unemployment, of course, in the early 90s because of distraction of the, market in the Soviet bloc, and many big enterprises were closed. But the problem is that we had huge hidden unemployment during communist times. Like this, many of this big industry would have never, existed in normal market economy. But the problem is that people associate, something bad that happened after 1989 with transition, and not with something that was caused by the socialist public policy. We try to be active in this field, and my previous think tank, Civil Development Forum, they created the virtual museum of transition. So to be active, especially among young people, to show them the history of late socialism and then transition. This is like an online website where you can enter the communist apartment block, when you can enter the anti-communist protest, when you can learn about many things, including graffiti during communist times. And then you can move through the history to learn how Polish economy and society changed. And we promote this in schools so that teachers can have attractive tool to attract young people to ideas of free market, and to show them the truth about socialism, because I would say many of young people, they have very they don't know the basic definitions, and they have kind of wrong image of socialism that is based on maybe some current examples, maybe Scandinavian model, but it's not really socialism. It's like a market economy with expanded welfare states. So this is, I think, the huge problem. But we are trying to tackle it, being present at schools.
And you're already touching on one of the questions about civic education, and it sounds like you have a a great example to share. Graeme, let's go to some of the interrelationships we started talking about between democracy and the economy, or democracy and development. What synergies do you see, and would you argue for bringing more democracy into development approaches?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I mean, I think it's interesting coming out of Marek's piece there is how quickly we fall into sort of dichotomies, sort of labels. The idea that if you don't like capitalism, then your only alternative is socialism, or if you don't like democracy, then the only alternative is autocracy or authoritarianism. And the way that narrative develops so easily is I think one of the issues we need to address on this. In that actually the point is that most things are along a spectrum. As Marek said, like the Scandinavian model isn't socialism. It's a sort of market economy with enhanced welfare benefits to it, and so it's about and that's the result of a sort of contestation, or a sort of and it's some kind of agreement within that society around the kind of economy and democracy they wanted. And what's interesting is watching now how that's sort of shifting over time with sort of the demographics that are happening there as well. And how is their democracy going to adapt to respond to that? And so I think that's why it's interesting for us thinking in from a development side is that we shouldn't be thinking about I don't think there's any doubt in the development sphere that market economy is the way to go. I mean, I don't think that's certainly been long held. But the question is, how is it regulated? How does it function? And sort of how does it produce the sort of inclusive growth and sort of more equitable outcomes? Because what most of the studies say, well, it's quite inconclusive around sort of, does development lead to democracy, or democracy to development? But sort of there's something definitely around inequality within societies having some kind of correlation with sort of democratization or not. So the idea here is that if you're looking for more equitable outcomes, for us, this feels like this has to be a democratic conversation. And how can you not introduce more democratic process into a conversation that's ultimately going to decide how the economy is structured over time? And there's some interesting work going on now at Chatham House, looking at the European context around the way in which economic policy has been in some ways depoliticized. That because the sort of the window of sort of economic policy is narrowed to a certain degree over a period of time, such that the parties have to find other issues on which to differentiate themselves. That used to be the great differentiator, and it's interesting, in the UK we're seeing that divide reemerge. But that if you have similar economic policies, you have to differentiate on other issues. And so whether that's part of what's contributing to sort of the sort of toxic polarization and sort of reach for identity politics that we see in democracy. So I think you have to have economic policy and economic issues integrated into sort of the democratic process to benefit both sides. That you end up with a democracy that's more rooted in sort of ideological debates, and you have economic policy that hopefully then emerges as being a more sort of shared and equitable outcome.
Great point. And continuing this discussion, Anne, about inequities, and there was a question in the chat. I mean, you already mentioned racial inequities. There's a question about technology. We have the digital haves and have-nots now, and we might have more capital intensive industry. So when you think about democracy and economic inequality or lack of opportunity, do you see democracy as counterbalancing what's happening in the market, to redistribute to people? Or what's the role of democracy in dealing with this scarcity and economic inequality?
Well, obviously, very big issues. I think that in many developing countries, particularly mine, but others as well, poverty is a much more important issue than inequality. So there is you know, there is this debate in the richer world, which is different, I think, from developing countries. And my experience is of middle income developing countries. And there I am convinced about the necessity for equality of opportunity. On the one hand, you have people who now get the vote. And I think one has to focus a great deal more on equality of opportunity in the kind of developing countries where so many people live in dire poverty. So we're talking about very fundamental issues. So take South Africa, where people don't get decent education, although we spend a lot of money on it, where so many people don't get a job, and many other issues. I'm in favor of focusing on equality of opportunity as really important, and giving as many people as possible access to the modern economy. So it's for workers to get into jobs that might not be fantastic jobs, but are a foothold into the modern economy. I think that's really important, so that people can see a future, and they can see a future for their children. And hopefully then they will see democracy delivering. So I think in developing countries, and now in some richer countries, we're seeing that democracies should not be taken for granted, that there's nothing inevitable about this. They have to deliver, and they have to deliver for a broad swathe of the population. So we tend to be the people, my think tank in South Africa tends to focus a great deal on how we expand opportunity, rather than, if you like, the mechanics of democracy, which is absolutely vital. And we have all sorts of challenges in that area. But I am in favor of thinking about development in ways that encourage experiments. In other words, if you like, more democratically. I want lots of experiments, because who knows what will work often. We're not all that sure. So experiments are important. I'm in favor of more power being devolved to, this is easy to say, but more power being devolved to big cities and to local governments that have capacity. So some kind of Spanish system where you have to prove some capacity to get more and more powers. But I'm in favor of devolution of power, if you like, within the particular political system, because I think that you've got more chance of development actually happening. No guarantee, of course, but centralizing everything tends to impose uniform answers across a country. And that was historically appalling and devastating for South Africa with apartheid. But today there's a real tension between those who want the state and the central state to make as many decisions as possible, which has also been really bad for development in the country. Very large numbers of our local authorities are not functional. So that's why I'm being hesitant on how you describe this, but I am in favor of devolution of power to allow more experiments to take place on growth and development, and hopefully a learning process, a demonstration effect will happen. So I'm not quite sure if that answers your question, Kim, but that would be my 2 cents worth on this.
Well, I gave you a fierce question, and I got it. I got a great response. I think Sami, feel free to comment on democracy that delivers, but I'm also thinking let's talk about what's really clicking with the audiences. How are people responding well or understanding, and whether you're talking to youth, is it the medium that matters? Do we need to be more viral in telling our stories? Do we need more evidence? Do we need somebody else to be telling the story? Like how do we get this message across about improving democracy and markets? And I'll start with you, Sami.
Let me get back to that question in just in a minute or so, just because, I mean, there's a lot of tension, right, between democracy and the market. And I think we lived in an era or a period where, you know, they were synonymous or seemed synonymous, particularly during the Cold War, because we saw historically that countries that were democratic were also had a market systems, you know, but that really was hiding a lot of tension. So because essentially, if you think about it, you know, one is trying to give equality, political, you know, equality, and one is actually going for economic inequality of sort, you know, and this whole universal suffrage versus private property is actually wasn't compatible. But this is what enhanced democracy and democratic institutions, I think, played a very important role post-World War II. In fact, where they actually moderated this tension between essentially those with the capital and those with the labor, those who are asking for redistribution and those who are asking for open markets, right? And that worked actually for a certain period of time, you know, worked in the sense that they reached a compromise whereby we'll open the borders, we go for globalization, global economies, but yet we redistribute through the welfare state. But then this system and things started to be undone, in fact, you know what I mean? And since probably late 70s or early 80s. And this is really, in my opinion, a major problem because the system now is broken. And it's broken for several reasons. One, you've got essentially the unions lost their role and capacities. The Socialist Party on the left are also don't have that support. You've got the fragmentation in the labor market and the rise of the gig economy right now, which even makes the laborers even in a worse position. And then you've got obviously those with capital. And here obviously there are the small, medium enterprises, but we're talking about here the big and large corporations right now who are in fact, you know, pushing for policies that really benefits a very small segment of these people and their sectors at the expense of society. And they're not necessarily innovative or productive. It's actually they're extracting more wealth, and hence you have a rise of an inequality in the world, right? And that is a problem because that is in fact becomes a threat to the whole system. So to me, this is really a serious issue that we need to sort of tackle this tension and bring it back. But when you see how a certain party is succumbing to these interests, whereby they're lowering, for example, right now, just like maybe a week ago in London, you know, in the United Kingdom, you know, lower taxes, removing the profit cap and the profits for bankers, you know. I mean, these are policies that I thought are just, you know, we're done with these policies. We know they don't work. They actually, we don't work. We know they don't work for the larger society. They work for the very, very few people. We see that here in Lebanon and the region, the high concentration of wealth. So all of that is actually a major threat, in my opinion, to democracy, because then it shows that those who are putting the rules are actually, you know, benefiting it at the expense of everyone else. Real income is falling, has been falling. Real wages has been falling, as you know, in the West and other countries. Now, having said that, we really need to sort of, I like Anne's work and Anne's point about experimentation, to think about different ways to experiment, to push for that. Yet there's no doubt the state has to be present, has to play an active role in this. And I think it's just been, in many ways, in many countries, has been hijacked by these interest groups. And so back to your question now, in terms of what could be done in terms of convincing the youth or others, you know, what to do about it. I think the counterfactual is important. Whereas, okay, in the absence of representative democracy, what do we have and what does that deliver? Because some people have the notion or think, hey, if you have an authoritarian regime or a dictator or autocratic leader, often is associated with development in the minds of some people, you know what I mean? Especially in countries where there's a lot of corruption, and they think, and it's misguided. Right? Because for every, I would argue, for every benevolent dictator, if that dictator even exists, there are 10 horrible ones, right? Who've made major, you know, either massacres or killed people or impoverished people. So I think it's very important to show and discuss, if we're unable to convince people the merits of democracy, maybe we also need to highlight the alternative and how this could actually be even worse. And hence go back to the point of how do we experiment and deepen and correct the representative institutions that we have so they can actually serve the people first and foremost. Thank you.
And speaking of the alternative, that reminds me of what Marek was saying about needing to educate people about what socialism actually is. And how do you try to reach people? I know you're a policy institute, but you've done a variety of things, even with youth entrepreneurship.
Well, I think let me respond a little to some of the things Sami said and then answer your question. The one is I do think there is a real difference between what's happening in, I'm going to use very vulgar distinction, so forgive me, sort of rich countries and developing countries. I think, and let me repeat, I think in developing countries, they need more companies, big, medium, and small size, and they need to deal with poverty much more. I recently interviewed, Kim told you I've been doing these interviews, and I interviewed a Columbia University professor, Alvin Panagaria, who was the head of the Prime Minister of India's think tank with cabinet rank. And he gives a really interesting example, which is worth thinking about. So India has many different states. One of the richest is Kerala, and one of the poorest is Bihar. Now, Bihar has much less inequality than Kerala. Which way is migration going? To Kerala. So I think that's an interesting story, which is partly an answer to Kim's question. I think we have to tell more stories that appeal to different kinds of audiences. But there are also stories about what a non-democratic country looks like, and most of them are pretty awful. Now, China is, of course, the great exception. If you're looking at economic growth and getting out of poverty, it's been phenomenal. On the other hand, its human rights record is increasingly appalling. So there are values at stake here and preferences. And I think we have to tell lots more stories. We have to, if you like, show different facets of the diamond, coming from a diamond producing country. Stay with the same story, but show for different audiences, find ways to connect with where they are. And we're certainly trying to do that. I won't say we're as good as I'd like to be, but we have over the last few years tried very hard to reach out beyond the political and business elite, which is hard enough to talk to, that requires a certain style, to different audiences, younger people, people living in poorer circumstances, and we're slowly learning how to do that. But so different stories for different audiences would be part of my sort of repertoire, but also I think really being careful about generalizations. What works in one country might not work in another country. Development is not simple, it's complex. And I think to just be generalized, the debate in Britain is really different from the debate in South Africa. This is one of the largest economies in the world for now, whereas South Africa is stagnant, and we are desperate to find ways in which to get growth going again and include more than half the population in a basic job and a decent education. So the challenges are very different, and I think stories need to be applicable to circumstance and audience. Mm-hmm. I'll stop there.
More stories and which story matters. Graeme, do you agree on storytelling? Would you add anything to that? I'm guessing that you don't export British democracy as the model to everyone, but any comment on this?
Yeah, well, no, I would back up the idea that I think there is a limit to which evidence can take us in making this case. I mean, for one, the evidence that does exist tends to be sort of mixed and very context specific, as Anne mentioned. So in some cases this works, and in other cases it doesn't. And then depending on how you sort of create the sample or manipulate the numbers, you can get different kinds of data, different kinds of outcomes. So there's not a lot that's pointing in all in one direction. But as we know from other fields, even having all the data moving in one direction doesn't mean that you win the argument. That we sort of live in a world now where people are swayed as much by sort of a feeling as they are that by sort of hard facts. So I think we need to find ways in which democracy and sort of markets and then we're sort of working together feel like they're delivering for people, and so people can get behind that in a sort of in a way that isn't based on sort of hard data or evidence. I mean, and in this we can sort of take some from the literature around disinformation, where actually the more you argue the opposite to disinformation, the more embedded sometimes that message becomes, so all the fact checking doesn't really change people's opinion, just makes them more likely to believe the disinformation. So whether we need to sort of change tack a bit there in terms of how we change the narrative on this.
Thank you, Graeme. And Marek, are you doing other exciting things that are changing people's minds? What's working or not working?
I also agree that storytelling is super important nowadays, and in general, much better communication is needed among supporters of free markets, but also democracy. I have experience working with many groups in Poland, but also in the region. There are a lot of think tanks, and they do a great job in terms of writing very interesting reports, research analysis. But I think they often miss the communication part in terms, even like we are also grant giving organizations. So when I see the grant applications, I see that people ask for a lot of money for research, but not enough for communication. I think this is the problem, that to be effective in communication, you also need resources for good quality videos, for good quality marketing materials, for paid advertising at social media and things like this to reach people and reach your targeted groups. And I often advise people who apply to grants for us, think about your budget once again. Think maybe you can, spend a bit less on research and spend more on communication. So resources are a big challenge, of course. I also think that target groups matters, and the messages should be very well targeted. Social media can help in it a lot today because you can use it to target your message to specific groups. The problem is that I also observe, as someone responsible for giving grants, is that a lot of people apply for projects related to young people, and I mentioned our projects promoting communists, problems with communists and transition, success of transition among young people. But I think we need more projects targeted at other groups, especially in Poland and other developed countries. I think we need organizations, think tanks, NGOs specializing in messages towards the older generation. We are, aging population. In Poland, in 20-30 years, half of the voters will be 60 plus. So if we want to have influence on reality or public policy, we need to inform, and we need good messages to people 60 plus. And I think we are really missing. We have like the big opportunity here, but we are not doing almost anything, I would say, especially, for example, in Poland, in messaging towards these groups. And I also agree with Anne about generalizations. And we hear this discussion also about implementing the whole models. We hear in Poland in discussions about democracy, let's implement Swiss model to have, referenda every quarter. But to implement Swiss model, you need, the same history as Switzerland, the history of local communities doing these things for 200, 300, 400 years. And with the economy, we often hear, oh, let's implement Swedish model. And you also have a huge cultural problem to implement the whole models like this. I often respond to the people who say, oh, let's implement Swedish model in Poland, that, okay, fine, but we have one big problem with this. We don't have enough Swedes living in Poland. And this is the problem. Like, we should explain people that these generalizations don't work, and you cannot, move the whole economic system of one country into another country if you don't have culture and history of this country. We can look at best practices, but we have to adjust them to the local conditions. And I think this is also very important when we message the policy proposals, that how to adjust best practices from other countries to our local conditions.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I've really been humbled by you expert panelists. You've kind of shown me the greater depth of complexity behind some of the questions than even I imagined. And yet at the same time, you've shown us some of the tools that are available. There may not be one tool that is the panacea, but we can think better about experiences and audiences and the tools that we put together. Not everything is a synergy, but we've certainly seen so much overlap in our values and elements of good models for democracy and market. So thank you very much for taking the time and sharing. Audience, please raise your virtual hands and applaud this outstanding panel. And I invite everyone to move to the plenary session for the wrap up of our second annual Free Enterprise and Democracy Network Conference. Thank you so much.